it was bigger than our own submarine. Right now, you know how big our submarines are, right? They're huge.
Yeah.
And I asked him, naively, I just kind of came out, well, what do you do when you encounter that?
Something is alive at the bottom of the Mariana Trench.
It's a big surprise. All of a sudden, we've got scientists saying, why is that?
And it knows we have been watching it. For years, scientists sent cameras down there, expecting emptiness. But what just came back now destroyed everything they thought they knew. Something is moving down there. Moving with structure, speed, and a level of deliberate purpose that made scientists tremble. And the deeper the cameras went, the more disturbing the footage became. Whatever is living down there has been hiding in that darkness far longer than anyone is willing to say. And it has been watching everything we send down there. And now, we finally have it on camera. The first men who went down. Picture two men climbing inside a steel ball barely large enough to sit in, knowing full well that if anything cracked, if anything failed, if anything went even slightly wrong, they would die alone in the darkest place on Earth, with nobody coming to help them. That was exactly what Jacques Piccard and Don Walsh did on the 23rd of January 1960, when they began sinking toward the bottom of the Mariana Trench in a vessel called the Trieste. By modern standards, that vessel was terrifying. The viewing windows were thick and narrow. The instruments were basic. There were no real cameras to speak of, and at those depths, no rescue service on Earth could have reached them in time to matter. Halfway through the descent, a sound like a gunshot exploded through the inside of the vessel. Both men went completely rigid, and for several long seconds, neither of them knew whether the hull had cracked open and they were already dead. What had actually happened was that one of the thick viewing windows had developed a hairline fracture under the weight of the building pressure. It had not fully failed, but it was damaged, and every additional foot of depth was squeezing that crack harder. Now, here is what makes that moment extraordinary. Piccard and Walsh looked at each other and decided to keep going. They sank the rest of the way down with that compromised window in a vessel one bad pressure spike away from being crushed like an empty can, with no way to call for help and no way out, except straight back up through miles of absolute darkness. They reached the bottom and had 20 minutes there, just 20 minutes at the deepest point on Earth, peering through a cracked window into a darkness so complete that their own floodlights barely dented it. And in those 20 minutes, both men saw something moving outside. These were not small things drifting lazily past. These were large shapes, moving with what both men described as clear, deliberate purpose, sliding just beyond the edge of their lights and melting back into the black. Piccard and Walsh were military officers and trained engineers, the kind of men who measured their words and reported only what they were certain of. They filed their observations carefully and without drama, and spent the rest of their lives standing behind what they saw. Because there was no camera that could capture it, the world moved on, and those shapes stayed buried in the logs under the single word: unexplained. 52 years later, James Cameron went down there alone, and this time, the whole world was watching. His submersible, the Deep Sea Challenger, was purpose-built and loaded with high-definition cameras, precision sonar, and instruments beaming data in real time to a surface team sitting above him. Whatever was down there this time, it was going to be on record. The descent began, and Cameron dropped fast, at 500 feet per minute. Then, at roughly 15,000 feet deep, still in open water, with the floor nowhere near, the sonar started going haywire. The readings spiked and dipped in a pattern so consistent and deliberate looking that the surface team began arguing with each other over whether they were watching instrument error or something genuinely moving in the water around him. What made those readings so deeply unsettling was not the spikes themselves, but the timing of them. They began in the middle of the descent and then stopped as Cameron approached the floor. Just think about that carefully. Pressure interference worsens with depth. It does not begin halfway down and then disappear. Temperature gradient interference is continuous, not selective. The one pattern that actually fit the data was something in the water column registering Cameron's approach from above and pulling back as he got close to the bottom. Something had noticed him coming, tracked him for miles through the dark, and cleared out before he arrived. Cameron himself reported something he could not attach any instrument reading to. He described a specific directional feeling of being watched from somewhere outside the hull. When he surfaced, the official statements described no significant discovery, but several members of the surface monitoring team said privately that the sonar data released to the public did not match the full record they had watched live during the dive. The The suggestion, never formally published and never officially denied, was that portions of the data had been quietly pulled before release. Not because what they showed was dramatic, but because what they showed could not be explained, and nobody wanted to be the one standing in front of a camera trying to explain it. When researchers finally pulled physical samples out of the Mariana Trench and got them under a laboratory microscope, what the analysis came back showing stopped scientists cold. But before getting into exactly what was found, it is worth understanding what was actually living down there, because most people picture the wrong thing entirely. The creature with metal bones. The word amphipod sounds small and forgettable, like something you would brush off your shoe at a beach without a second thought. But the supergiant amphipods of the Mariana Trench are armored, multi-limbed, hard-bodied creatures that grow to lengths of over a foot, roughly the size of a grown man's forearm, and they look like something engineered specifically to survive conditions that would obliterate almost every other living thing on Earth. In 2012, researchers dropped a baited trap to nearly 23,000 feet into the Mariana Trench and pulled it back up. It came back with over 400 individual amphipods from a single drop. The deepest, darkest, most savage place on Earth was not a silent wasteland with a few desperate creatures barely hanging on. It was teeming with living creatures, and dense, thriving, enormous populations of these animals had been living down there in the dark for God knows how long, completely invisible to us, multiplying in numbers that nobody had anticipated. And we had barely known they existed until we started looking. What the laboratory analysis revealed about their bodies was the part that genuinely broke the rules. Every crustacean on Earth builds its outer shell from calcium carbonate, the same material found in coral, seashells, and bones. This is not a quirk or a tendency of certain species. It is a biological rule consistent across hundreds of thousands of crustacean species in every ocean on every continent. But the supergiant amphipods of the Mariana Trench were building their exoskeletons with aluminum. Aluminum, a metal that no other crustacean species anywhere on Earth has ever been found using for any biological purpose. And the aluminum in their bodies was not something they had passively absorbed from the water around them, the way a sponge absorbs liquid. The concentrations were far too high for that. These animals were actively selecting aluminum from their environment and incorporating it into their own body structure through a biological process that has no equivalent in any other living creature ever studied on this planet. Nobody knows how they do it. Nobody knows what the aluminum actually does for them, whether it reinforces the shell, whether it protects against toxins, or whether it is a defense against predators living down there that have never been identified or given a name. And then the tissue analysis went deeper, and what it found should make every person alive genuinely furious. Inside the bodies of these animals, scientists found microplastics, human-made plastic fragments lodged in the tissue of creatures living nearly 7 miles underwater in one of the most isolated places on the surface of this Earth. Even worse than that, the plastics included polychlorinated biphenyls, which are industrial chemicals so toxic they were banned in most countries during the 1970s. The concentration of these chemicals found in the tissue of Mariana Trench amphipods was significantly higher than in amphipods collected from heavily polluted harbors sitting right next to active industrial facilities on the surface. Let that sink in for a moment. The deepest, most untouched place on the entire planet is more chemically contaminated than a filthy port with factory pipes draining into it. These animals had been absorbing decades of human industrial poison in total darkness, 7 miles below the nearest sunlight, with no escape and no way to tell anyone what was happening to them. What the amphipods analysis revealed was shocking enough to rattle any scientist. But here's the thing about the Mariana Trench. Every time researchers think they have finally seen the most bizarre thing it has to offer, the trench reaches back and proves them spectacularly wrong, because the next discoveries were not pulled up and examined under laboratory lights. These ones were watched live, in real time, on ROV cameras, while they were still moving, still glowing, still doing things in the dark that their species had absolutely no business being able to do. And the footage that came back from those cameras was the kind that makes even the most experienced marine biologists go completely silent mid-sentence. The things that should not float. Sea cucumbers are about as thoroughly understood as any ocean animal gets. Scientists have studied them for well over a century, and the conclusion has always been the same. They live on the bottom and crawl along the seafloor, filtering sediment for organic matter. Every single species, in every ocean, at every depth, stays on the floor. That is simply what a sea cucumber does. So, when an ROV camera in the Mariana Trench caught one hovering freely in the middle of the water column, glowing a deep violet, and moving through the dark water with slow and deliberate grace, the scientists watching the live feed were knocked completely sideways. One of them reportedly said out loud, "What is that doing up there?" Nobody in the room had an answer. This was not a sea cucumber that had been knocked loose from the bottom by a current and was helplessly tumbling through the water. It was floating with control, using fin-like appendages along its body to steer itself through a column of water where no sunlight had ever penetrated in the entire history of the planet. The family this creature belongs to earned the nickname the Headless Chicken Monster when related footage from the Southern Ocean went viral in 2017 because of how deeply alien its free-swimming form looked on camera. That Southern Ocean specimen lives in conditions that are dramatically shallower, warmer, and far less crushing than the Mariana Trench. The version filmed in the trench was doing the same thing under pressures 4 times greater, meaning the internal physical changes required for its body to float freely at that depth are significantly more extreme than anything the viral footage showed. That was alarming enough on its own. Then the ROV drifted a little further and found the other one, and the alarm level went somewhere else entirely. A transparent creature, roughly the size of a dinner plate, was hanging in the water column completely still. It was glowing in 3 colors at once, red, blue, and violet, cycling through all 3 simultaneously in shifting patterns that served a purpose science has not yet cracked. It was a hydromedusa, which is a true jellyfish and a genuine predator, far more aggressive than the soft drifting animals it superficially resembles in shape. Most jellyfish go where the current pushes them. They have limited muscular control and they catch whatever happens to float into their tentacles. But this one was holding its exact position against the deep water current, with its bell almost completely motionless, which requires a level of continuous, active, precise muscular control that known jellyfish anatomy is simply not supposed to be capable of producing. When something drifted nearby, the creature spread its tentacles outward in a perfectly symmetrical, geometric formation, not randomly and not in a sudden reactive snap, but in a slow, coordinated, almost architectural arrangement that looked designed rather than instinctive. Then it drew them back in with a precision that made one of the scientists watching the footage describe it, without any irony, as looking remotely controlled. Another scientist watching the same footage raised the possibility that this could be an entirely new genus of jellyfish that had never been documented in any scientific literature. A new genus, meaning not just a new species, but a whole new category of animal that nobody had ever classified or named. Now, think about the energy this creature was burning to do all of that. In an environment where food is desperately scarce, and every single calorie is the difference between surviving and dying, producing bioluminescent light across 3 separate biochemical pathways at the same time is an extraordinarily expensive biological strategy. Most deep-sea bioluminescent animals produce one color, typically blue-green, because that wavelength travels the furthest through water and reaches the most potential targets. Red light is absorbed by seawater very quickly and can only be detected at very close range. Blue travels to mid-range. Violet carries further. An animal producing all 3 colors at the same moment is not being wasteful or decorative. It is simultaneously sending a close-range signal, a mid-range signal, and a long-range signal to different things at different distances in the dark water around it. The Mariana Trench, which humanity had always pictured as empty and silent, was full of living things actively sending layered messages to each other through the darkness. The question of what those messages said and who or what was receiving them has not been answered. What the floating sea cucumber and the glowing jellyfish had in common was that they were both small and slow enough for the ROV cameras to hold on them and get clean footage. The scientists were shaken, but at least they could see what they were dealing with. What came next offered no such comfort, because the next things picked up in the Mariana Trench were not small, they were not slow, and by every indication from multiple separate expeditions, they were completely aware that something had come down into their darkness to look at them. The shapes that move like they know you're watching. Across multiple deep-sea expeditions carried out by completely separate teams, on different vessels, with different equipment, in different years, sonar systems operating in and around the Mariana Trench recorded signatures that matched nothing in any classification database. This was not one bad team blaming their instruments after a frustrating dive. This was the same pattern surfacing again and again across independent observations separated by years and thousands of miles of ocean. The objects showing up on sonar were changing direction at speeds that blew past the documented physical limits of every large marine species on record, moving faster than whales, faster than any large fish, and making directional changes so sharp that in some cases they appeared nearly instantaneous. In 2014, a U.S. Navy acoustic surveillance network built during the Cold War to track nuclear submarines attempting silent passage across ocean floors picked up a signal near the Mariana Trench that did not match a single entry in its entire classification system. This network was sensitive enough to detect the quietest, most acoustically stealthy objects that human engineering had ever produced. For anything to register on it at all, it had to generate a coherent, sustained acoustic signature, strong enough to rise above the natural background noise of the ocean. The signal moved, covering thousands of miles over several days, at a consistent maintained speed before going silent. The Navy has not explained it. Not then, not in the years since, not ever. Beyond the sonar, ROV operators on multiple separate expeditions had reported something worse that made direct visual contact. These were shapes appearing within the actual range of the ROV's own lights, close enough to the camera for form and movement to show up on the feed. And the descriptions coming back from teams who had no contact with each other at the time of their respective encounters were disturbingly consistent. Elongated bodies, large fins or appendages, and movement that was directional and purposeful rather than the passive drift of a neutrally buoyant animal going where the current takes it. More than one team noted that the shapes appeared to be adjusting their position in direct relation to where the ROV was. Whatever these shapes were, they had noticed the ROV, and they were deciding what to do about it. Then in 2019, a Chinese research vessel near the Mariana Trench recovered an ROV from approximately 29,000 feet that had gone dark and unresponsive during its deployment. When the vehicle came back up to the surface, the recovery crew found sections of the outer housing badly damaged in a way that was consistent with impact from a large, blunt object hitting it with considerable force. The footage from the entire period when the ROV had gone silent was corrupted beyond any recovery. The navigation data from that same window of time was also gone. Chinese state media published a short report on the incident, and then that story was yanked from every platform it had appeared on. No official explanation was ever released. The survey area where the ROV had been operating was well mapped, and a collision with a known geological feature like a ridge or an escarpment would have shown up in the navigation logs. The navigation logs no longer existed. Scientists have a framework called deep-sea gigantism that attempts to account for large animals at extreme depth. It is a real and documented phenomenon where species grow significantly larger in cold, high-pressure, food-scarce environments because slower metabolism allows continuous growth over longer lifespans, reduced predation removes the upper size limit, and storing more energy in a larger body makes biological sense when food is unpredictable. The Japanese spider crab already reaches leg spans of up to 12 feet in Pacific waters far shallower than the trench. Colossal squid from the Southern Ocean reach lengths that would have been dismissed as sailor mythology a century ago. What gigantism scaling suggests about species adapted specifically to the conditions of the Mariana Trench, where the cold is more severe and the pressure is orders of magnitude greater than anything a spider crab or a colossal squid experiences, is that no upper size limit for life at those depths has ever been found. The reason it has never been found is not that it does not exist. The reason is that the trench floor covers an area larger than the state of Wyoming, and across the entire history of human deep-sea exploration, the total area directly observed by human instruments amounts to roughly the equivalent of a few football fields. Whatever the largest things living in the deepest sections of that system actually are, we have never seen them. We have only barely come close to the places where they live. Everything so far, the sonar signatures, the shapes moving through the water, the damaged ROV, all of it was happening in the water column itself. But then scientists did something that cracked the investigation wide open. They stopped looking at what was swimming through the trench and started looking at what was buried beneath it. And what the instruments found underneath that floor was somehow darker than anything the water above it had already shown them. What's buried under the trench floor? Using seismic imaging technology, which works by sending pulses of energy through rock and earth and reading how those pulses behave to map what lies below, survey teams identified zones beneath the trench floor where the signals were being blocked, deflected, and absorbed in patterns that known geological formations simply do not produce. What made these zones genuinely alarming was the sharpness of their edges. The signal did not gradually weaken the way it does when passing through dense rock. It changed behavior abruptly, as if it had hit a defined boundary, the kind of hard geometric edge that natural random geological formations do not generate. Researchers named these regions impenetrable structures, and the geological explanations offered for them included ancient crustal formations crushed by millions of years of tectonic activity, deposits of methane hydrates, which are frozen gas compounds that form under extreme cold and pressure, and concentrations of metallic minerals that alter the way acoustic energy moves through them. None of these explanations fully accounted for the boundary sharpness that the instruments kept recording. The possibility that a number of serious researchers have declined to rule out is that these zones are sealed chambers, physically enclosed spaces beneath the ocean floor that have been cut off from the surface world and from every ecosystem above them, potentially for millions upon millions of years. If that sounds like science fiction, consider what happened in 1977 when researchers discovered hydrothermal vent communities for the first time, which are complete, thriving ecosystems living in total darkness on the ocean floor, powered entirely by chemical energy from the Earth itself, rather than sunlight from above. Before 1977, the scientific consensus was not vague or uncertain on this point. It was firm and it was clear. Complex life requires sunlight. Full stop. That consensus was not gradually softened through polite academic debate. It was demolished overnight by direct physical evidence. If sealed chambers exist beneath the Mariana Trench floor, and they connect to any hydrothermal activity at all, the things living inside them would have had no sunlight, no contact with the surface ocean, and potentially millions of years of completely isolated evolutionary history to draw from. What they might have become during that time is something that no existing biological framework could meaningfully prepare us to understand. The most powerful seismic tool scientists have applied to this problem is a technique called full waveform inversion, which processes the behavior of seismic waves to produce detailed images of what lies beneath the Earth's surface at extreme depth. In the Mariana Trench region, this technique detected anomalies extending 1,200 kilometers into the Earth's mantle. To understand what that number actually means in real terms, the trench itself is approximately 11 kilometers deep. These anomalies were registering more than 100 times deeper than the floor of the trench, reaching into a part of the Earth's interior where, by every standard geological model currently in use, the material should have melted and been recycled back into the planet millions of years ago. Instead, the data showed stacked, layered structures preserving the characteristics of ancient oceanic crust intact, sitting far deeper than they had any geological right to exist, in a region where the models said they should have been consumed long ago. To add to all of that, research published in 2018 found that the Mariana Trench subduction zone, where one tectonic plate dives beneath another and drags material down into the Earth, was pulling 3 times more water into the mantle than anyone had previously calculated. Billions of tons of ocean water were being swallowed into the body of the Earth along this single geological boundary. Water under mantle pressure and temperature does not behave the way water at the surface does. It stays liquid at temperatures far above its normal boiling point. It dissolves minerals that would otherwise be completely insoluble. It drives chemical reactions that release energy. Whether those conditions, operating deep inside the Earth directly beneath the Mariana Trench, are capable of sustaining microbial life, which is the most tenacious and adaptable form of life ever discovered anywhere on this planet, remains an open and unresolved scientific question. And in 2005, a series of seismic events were recorded directly beneath Challenger Deep, originating just a few kilometers below the trench floor, with waveforms that did not match standard tectonic profiles, and that occurred in a pattern rather than randomly, the way normal tectonic microseismic activity always does. They were recorded, described as anomalous in the data, and then the subject was officially dropped without a published explanation. All of it, the impenetrable structures, the anomalies buried 1,200 kilometers into the Earth, the patterned seismic events beneath the floor, was instrument data. Yes, they were unsettling, but nothing a camera had actually seen with its own lens. What happened next was different, because at 35,700 feet, an ROV camera saw something with its own lens, something that had no business being there, and the moment it appeared on screen, the feed died. The metallic structure at 35,700 feet, and the video that cut off. At the depth of 35,700 feet below the surface of the Pacific Ocean, the ROV crawling through the Mariana Trench was less than 300 feet from the absolute bottom of the planet. The pressure around the vehicle at that point was so immense that it would cave in a steel structure not specifically engineered to withstand it. The floor beneath the ROV was covered in a layer of sediment called diatomaceous ooze, a soft, pale, cream-colored material made up of the compressed remains of microscopic organisms that have been drifting down from the surface ocean for millions of years. It sits completely still down there and absorbs light rather than reflect it. It is featureless under the ROV's floodlights, stretching in every direction like a pale, undisturbed desert that the sun has never touched and nothing has ever crossed. Against that surface, anything that catches light and throws it back would stand out with the kind of absolute, unmistakable clarity that leaves no room for confusion or misinterpretation. The ROV's camera picked up something on that floor, and the crew watching the live feed on the surface went very quiet very quickly. The object was catching the vehicle's floodlights and throwing them back in a way that the sediment and rock and organic material in that environment simply do not do. The crew described it as metallic in appearance. What hit them hardest after the reflectivity was the shape of the thing. It was not irregular, it was not fractured or asymmetric or randomly formed. The way rock formations and mineral deposits look after millions of years of geological pressure and chemical process. It had geometry, it had defined edges, it had the kind of structured, deliberate form that, on the surface of the Earth, you would associate without hesitation with something that had been manufactured rather than formed by nature. One crew member reportedly said, "That does not belong there," and the room went silent because nobody disagreed. Then, within seconds of the object appearing on screen, the feed went dead. The transmission did not degrade gradually, or fill with static, or lose signal bit by bit. It cut out, completely and instantly, as if someone had simply switched it off. And here is the technical reality that makes that cut genuinely terrifying. Deep-sea ROVs use fiber optic tether cables to transmit data to the surface because fiber optic technology is not affected by pressure, not affected by cold, and not affected by the chemical environment of the Mariana Trench. Those are precisely the reasons the deep-sea industry switched to fiber optic cables. The things that cause sudden, complete fiber optic signal failure are physical damage to the cable, electromagnetic interference powerful enough to overwhelm the signal entirely, or deliberate jamming. When the feed eventually came back and the crew checked the tether, it was completely intact. No fractures, no damage, no sign of any physical compromise anywhere along its length. No natural electromagnetic source in the Mariana Trench environment has ever been identified that could produce the kind of interference capable of cutting a fiber optic signal. The feed died. The cable was fine. Nobody has explained what happened in between those two facts. When the camera came back online and the crew angled it toward the same section of floor, the metallic structure was gone. Completely gone. The floor and the frame showed nothing but unbroken, undisturbed, pale ooze. As if the object had never been there. As if the crew had imagined the whole thing. Except they had not imagined it because in the seconds just before the feed cut out, the instruments had registered the presence of an unidentified moving object in the immediate area of the structure. Hold that sequence in your mind and really think about what it means. A geometrically structured, reflective, apparently metallic object appears on the seafloor at the deepest point on Earth. The instruments detect something moving near it. The fiber optic feed cuts off with no physical explanation. The camera comes back online, and the object has vanished without a trace. Geological features do not vanish from seafloor cameras between signal interruptions. The sequence of events demands a single conclusion, that whatever the crew filmed was not fixed to the floor, and that something moved it, or it moved itself, during the window when the camera was dark. Scientists reviewing the incident put 4 possible explanations on the table. Hydrothermal mineral deposits producing unusual reflectivity was the first. But hydrothermal mineral formations are irregular and non-planar in shape, and the structure the crew described was neither of those things. Sunken vessel debris that had drifted to extreme depth was the second. But debris descending through miles of ocean under continuously building pressure does not arrive at the bottom as a structurally coherent, geometrically regular object with defined edges. Scrap metal from an old wreck was the third, and the same problem destroyed that explanation as well, compounded by the fact that no known wreck in the region could account for what the camera captured. The fourth explanation was classified technology, an advanced vehicle or instrument belonging to a government agency running deep-sea operations that are not disclosed to the public. This is the explanation that the behavior of the video feed makes the most difficult to dismiss, because if the object had been a natural, stationary geological feature, the feed cutting at the precise moment it appeared on screen, and the object disappearing entirely when the feed returned, would require a coincidence so surgically specific that it collapses under its own improbability. The footage from the 35,700-foot sighting has been analyzed. Whatever data survived, the signal interruption has been reviewed by people who have kept their conclusions to themselves. No follow-up expedition has returned with anything more. No official statement has ever accounted for all four elements of the incident at once: the structured reflective object, the instrument reading of a moving object nearby, the unexplained fiber optic failure, and the disappearance of the structure when the feed came back. Whatever has been living in the deepest place on Earth has had the entire history of this planet to settle into the dark, to grow, to adapt, and to learn exactly how to stay invisible. And from everything the cameras and the sonar and the instruments have managed to capture, it is very, very good at exactly that.